Sarah had always believed that the truth had a way of coming out, no matter how deep someone buried it. She had grown up hearing that from her father, Daniel, a quiet, careful man who never raised his voice but always seemed to know more than he said. She had believed those words her entire life, but she never thought the day would come when those words would be aimed at her own husband. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Marcus came home with flowers. Not the cheap ones from a gas station, but a full, bright bouquet from the expensive shop downtown. The kind he only bought on anniversaries or when he had very good news. Sarah was standing in the kitchen cutting vegetables when she heard the front door open wide, heard his footsteps loud and fast across the floor, and then saw him appear in the doorway with that big smile she had fallen in love with 12 years ago. "We won," he said. Just those two words. But the way he said them, with his chest lifted and his eyes bright, told her everything. Sarah put down the knife and wiped her hands on the kitchen towel. "The Brennan case?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Every single point," Marcus said, walking toward her and setting the flowers on the counter before pulling her into a hug. "Judge ruled in our client's favor completely. Full settlement. The other side got nothing." She hugged him back. She smiled. She told him she was proud of him. And she was, truly, she was. Marcus had worked on the Brennan property case for almost 2 years. It had consumed his weekends, stolen his sleep, and filled their dining table with stacks of legal papers that she had carefully moved aside every morning just to have space for breakfast. A win like this was real. It was earned. She had no reason to feel anything but happy. But something sat quietly in her chest that she could not name. They celebrated that evening. Marcus called his partner at the firm, opened a bottle of wine he had been saving, and talked for most of the dinner about the closing arguments, the judge's reaction, and the look on the opposing counsel's face when the ruling was read. Sarah listened and nodded and laughed at the right moments. She refilled his glass. She told him again that he had worked hard for this. Later that night, after Marcus had fallen asleep, still wearing his happy expression even in rest, Sarah sat at the kitchen table alone with a cup of tea that had gone cold. She could not sleep. The unnameable feeling was still there, pressing gently against her ribs. She tried to trace it. Was she jealous? No. She had her own work, her own quiet satisfaction in it. Was she worried about something? The children were fine. Her health was fine. The house was fine. Everything was fine. She picked up her phone and opened it without any real plan. And that was when she saw the notification, a message from her father sent 3 hours ago that she had missed during the celebration dinner. "Sarah, when you have a moment, I'd like to talk to you. It is important. Come by when you can." "Dad." Her father never texted. He believed phones were for calls. The fact that he had typed out a message and sent it meant he had something to say that he was not sure he could say out loud on the spot. That thought made Sarah's stomach tighten in a way she could not explain. She typed back quickly, "I'll come tomorrow morning. Is everything okay?" His reply came within minutes, which was unusual for a man who treated technology like an inconvenience. "Yes, just come. We will talk." She set the phone down and stared at the wall. Her father was 71 years old and in good health for his age. He walked every morning. He ate carefully. He read 2 newspapers every day and kept his mind sharp. Whatever he wanted to talk about was not medical. His tone, even in plain written words, had that quality she recognized from childhood. It was the tone he used when something needed to be said that no one wanted to say. The next morning, Sarah told Marcus she was going to check on her father. He was already dressed for a day of post-victory meetings at the firm and barely looked up from his phone when she mentioned it. "Tell him I said hello," Marcus said, kissing her on the cheek. "I will," she said. She drove the 20 minutes to her father's house on the edge of town, the same house she had grown up in, with the same blue mailbox and the same crooked garden gate that her father had promised to fix for 15 years and never did. When she pulled into the driveway, she saw him already sitting on the front porch in his usual chair, a cup of coffee resting on the small table beside him. He was watching the road as if he had been waiting. He raised one hand when he saw her car. Not a wave, more like an acknowledgement. Like he was checking off a box in his mind that said, "She came." Sarah got out of the car and walked up the porch steps. She kissed her father on the cheek and sat in the chair across from him. For a moment, they both just looked at the quiet street. A neighbor's dog barked far away. A car passed slowly. "You look tired," her father said. "I didn't sleep well," she said. He nodded like that was the answer he expected. He picked up his coffee and took a slow sip. Then he set it down and looked at her with the expression she remembered from every serious conversation of her life. Steady, unafraid, ready. How long have you and Marcus been married? He asked. Sarah blinked. 12 years, Dad. You were at the wedding. I know, he said. I was just making sure you still counted them. She frowned. What is this about? Daniel clasped his hands together on his lap. He looked down at them for a moment, then back up at her. Do you know a man named Gerald Brennan? The name hit her like cold water. That's Marcus's client, she said carefully. The one who just won the case yesterday. Yes, her father said. That is the one. How do you know that name? Her father was quiet for a long moment. The kind of quiet that meant he was choosing which door to open first, knowing that once he opened it, there would be no closing it again. Gerald Brennan, he said slowly, is not just Marcus's client. He is also the man who owns the land next to the river property on the east side of this town. The land that was at the center of that court case. Sarah nodded. She had heard pieces of this from Marcus over 2 years. I know that much, she said. What you don't know, her father said, is that I was offered money 3 months ago. A significant amount of money. I was told not to come forward with something I knew. Something about that property. Something about how Marcus's client got that land in the first place. Sarah's breath slowed down. What are you saying? Her father looked at her directly. I'm saying that I was asked to stay quiet. And for 3 months, I did. Because I was afraid. Not for myself, but for you. I didn't want to be the one to crack open the life you had built. He paused. But I watched you last night from the outside. I drove past your house during the celebration. I saw the lights on, and I knew Marcus had won. And I sat in my car and I thought about what kind of father I am. He leaned forward slightly. I cannot stay quiet anymore. Sarah sat very still. The morning air felt thinner somehow, like something had shifted in the atmosphere. Dad, she said, and her voice was barely above a whisper. What did you know? He took one more slow breath. And then he began to tell her everything. Daniel began slowly. The way a person begins when they know what they are about to say cannot be unsaid. He told Sarah that it had started about 4 years ago, long before Marcus had ever taken on the Brennan case. Gerald Brennan had come to this town quietly and bought land near the river, a large stretch of property that sat beside the old farming plots that families in the area had worked for generations. Most people did not pay much attention to it at the time. Land changed hands. That was normal. But Daniel had paid attention, because the land that Brennan purchased sat directly against a strip of ground that Daniel himself had been holding in his name for over 20 years, a narrow piece of inherited property that had belonged to his own father before him. The 2 pieces of land shared a border, and within that border was a water access point, a channel that fed from the river into the surrounding properties. Without that access, certain parts of the land became nearly worthless for any practical use. With it, the land could be developed, farmed, or sold for a great deal of money. Gerald Brennan had wanted that water access from the beginning. Daniel told Sarah that Brennan had approached him twice in the early years, politely at first, with offers and handshakes and promises of fair prices. Daniel had declined. The land was not something he wanted to sell. It had been in his family. His own father had walked that ground. He felt a responsibility to it that had nothing to do with money. After the second refusal, Brennan had gone quiet, and Daniel had assumed that was the end of it. But it was not the end of it. About 3 years ago, Daniel had started noticing things. Small things at first. A survey marker on his land that he had not authorized. A notice in the mail about a boundary review that he had never requested. He had asked around quietly and learned that someone had filed a minor land dispute claim that named his property edge as uncertain. The claim was thin and poorly sourced, but it was enough to create a cloud, a legal doubt, over his ownership of that narrow water access strip. He had hired a local lawyer to look into it. The lawyer had done some digging and told Daniel that the claim appeared to have been generated through an old misrecording in the county office, a document from decades ago that had been resubmitted recently with a slightly different measurement. The difference was small enough that most people would not notice. But in legal terms, that small difference was enough to call the boundary into question. Daniel had been suspicious, but had no proof of anything deliberate. He let the matter sit, kept watching, and waited. Then, about 18 months ago, he had run into an old acquaintance, a man named Roy Teller who had worked for years as a county records clerk before retiring. Roy was not a dramatic man. He was the kind of person who spoke plainly and did not exaggerate. Over coffee one afternoon, Roy had mentioned, almost casually, that he had seen something unusual before he retired. He had been asked, not officially, but by someone connected to a property investor, to pull old land measurement files and make a note of certain documents. He had not understood what it was for at the time. But after he retired and the Brennan case started making local noise, he had put the pieces together. Roy believed that someone had used those old files to manufacture the boundary confusion on Daniel's property, and possibly on others nearby as well. He did not know who had instructed it, but he knew it had not happened by accident. Daniel had sat with this information for months. He had not gone to the police because Roy had nothing concrete. It was memory and suspicion, not evidence. He had not gone to a lawyer because he did not know which lawyers in town could be trusted, given that the matter was already inside the legal system. And he had not told Sarah because Marcus was a lawyer, and the case that was working its way through the courts was starting to look like it involved the very same land and the very same boundary questions. He had not wanted to believe that his son-in-law was connected to any of it. He had watched Marcus for signs. He had listened carefully when Marcus mentioned the Brennan case at family dinners. Offhand comments, nothing detailed. And for a while, Daniel had told himself that Marcus was simply doing his job, that clients came with complicated histories, and that a good lawyer did not always know the full story behind the case they were handed. But then, 3 months ago, a man had come to Daniel's door. He was well-dressed and spoke carefully. He said he represented certain business interests and that Daniel's cooperation would be appreciated. He did not say cooperation with what, exactly, but he made it clear that if Daniel had any information about the boundary dispute history, anything from Roy Teller or anyone else, it would be best for Daniel's family if that information stayed private. He used the word family more than once. He said that sometimes people who got involved in legal matters that didn't concern them found things becoming complicated. He left an envelope on the porch table before he walked away. Daniel had not opened it. He had picked it up with 2 fingers and placed it in the drawer of his desk, where it had sat ever since. Sarah had gone very still during all of this. She had not moved. She had not interrupted. She had let every word land the way it needed to land, and she felt each one settle into her with a weight that was unlike anything she had experienced before. Not grief exactly, not anger exactly, but something that was made of both and sat heavier than either alone. "Do you still have the envelope?" she asked when her father finished. "Yes," Daniel said. "And Roy Teller, is he still in town?" "He is. He's 73 and lives on Mercer Street. He told me this in confidence, but he told me because he thought someone should know." Sarah looked at her hands. They were folded in her lap, and she noticed they were not shaking, which surprised her. Inside she felt as though the ground had shifted, but her hands were calm. "Does Marcus know any of this?" she asked. Her father looked at her with the careful, honest eyes she had trusted her entire life. "That," he said, "is the question I cannot answer for you. I don't know what Marcus knows. I don't know if he was told the full story of this case, or if he was used by someone who knew more than him. I cannot tell you he is guilty of anything. But I also cannot tell you that everything is clean." Sarah stood up from the chair slowly. She walked to the edge of the porch and looked out at the street. The same street she had run down as a child. The same trees she had climbed. The same houses she had known all her life. Everything looked the same. Nothing felt the same. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" she asked, not with anger, just with the honest need to understand. Her father was quiet for a moment. "Because I watched you build something good," he said. "A home, children, a life. And I was afraid that if I pulled this thread, everything you had built might come apart." He paused. "But I realized last night that staying quiet wasn't protecting you. It was protecting my own fear of watching you hurt." She turned and looked at him. His face was tired in a way it had not been a year ago. She realized then how much this had been sitting on him. 3 months of carrying something alone. 3 months of watching his daughter celebrate with a man whose case he did not trust. "I need to see that envelope," she said. Daniel nodded and stood up from his chair. He moved slowly but steadily toward the front door. Sarah followed him inside, into the house that smelled like coffee and old wood, and the same soap her father had used for as long as she could remember. He went to his desk in the small side room and opened the drawer. The envelope was there, white and plain, with no writing on the outside. He handed it to her. She turned it over in her hands. She had a choice to make in this moment. She could put it back in the drawer and walk out of the house and go home to her husband with his flowers and his celebration and tell herself that her father was an old man who had misunderstood something. She could choose the comfortable version of the story, or she could open the envelope. She slid her finger under the seal. Inside was a folded piece of paper and beneath it, a smaller card with a name and a number printed on it. She unfolded the paper and read it. It was short, only a few lines. But those lines told her, in plain and direct language, exactly how much someone had been willing to pay for her father's silence. The number was not small, and the name at the bottom of the card, the name of the person who had sent the man to her father's door, was a name she recognized. It was not Marcus's name, but it was someone Marcus had dinner with 4 times in the past year. Someone he had mentioned with warmth and trust. Someone who sat at the edge of this case like a shadow she had never thought to look at directly. She folded the paper carefully and placed it back in the envelope. "I need a few days," she told her father. "Don't talk to anyone about this yet. Not Roy, not anyone." "What are you going to do?" he asked. Sarah looked at the envelope in her hands and then at her father's face, steady, worried, waiting. "I'm going to find out," she said, "exactly what my husband knows." The drive home felt longer than 20 minutes. Sarah gripped the steering wheel and let the road move under her in silence. She did not turn on the radio. She did not call anyone. She just drove and let her thoughts settle the way water settles after something heavy has been dropped into it, slowly, in rings that spread outward until they reach every edge. By the time she pulled into her driveway, she had made a decision. She was not going to confront Marcus with accusations she could not yet support. She was not going to cry or shake or fall apart. She was going to watch and listen and gather what she could gather, because she had learned from her father that patience was not weakness. It was the most powerful tool a careful person had. Marcus came home that evening still carrying the energy of his court win. He talked about a lunch meeting he had with partners at the firm and mentioned that Gerald Brennan had sent over a gift basket as a thank you. "Fine things," he said, "quality items." He seemed comfortable, relaxed. Sarah watched him over dinner and looked for the things she had never looked for before. Small pauses, avoidance, the way his eyes moved when he mentioned certain names. The name she was watching for was Philip Harrow. That was the name on the card inside the envelope. Philip Harrow, a property developer who had moved to the area about 5 years ago, established himself quietly through a series of small investments, and had become friendly with Marcus through a shared membership at a downtown business club. Sarah had met him at 2 dinners over the past year. She remembered him as charming in a polished way, the kind of charming that never quite settled into warmth. He asked people good questions, but revealed very little about himself. She had not thought much about him before. Now she thought about almost nothing else. Over the next 2 days, Sarah moved carefully. She went through her own memory first, collecting every detail she could find without touching anything in the house that might alert Marcus. She remembered that Philip Harrow had called Marcus late on a Sunday evening about 6 months ago, and Marcus had stepped outside to take the call. She remembered that Marcus had once mentioned, almost in passing, that Harrow had some interest in the Brennan property outcome, but that it was indirect. She had not asked about it at the time. She wished now that she had. On the 3rd day, she called Roy Teller. She introduced herself as Daniel's daughter and told him only that her father had shared some of what he knew and that she was trying to understand the full picture, not to cause trouble, but to know the truth. Roy was quiet on the phone for a long moment. Then he said he had been waiting for someone to call. He said he had not slept well in months. They met the following afternoon at a small cafe outside the main part of town, the kind of place with wooden tables and poor lighting and no one who would recognize either of them. Roy was a thin man with careful eyes and hands that wrapped around his coffee cup like he needed something to hold. He told her what he knew in the same plain way her father had described, steady and honest, without drama. Roy confirmed that before he retired, he had been approached by a man he later identified as working for Philip Harrow's development company. He had been asked to pull specific historical land records, boundary filings from 30 and 40 years ago, and to note which ones had measurement inconsistencies. He had not been told why. He had been offered a small payment framed as research consultation. He had accepted it because he had not understood what it was for. After he retired, the Brennan case had grown in the local news. Roy had recognized the names and the property descriptions. He had done his own reading and realized that the boundary confusion at the heart of the case, the very confusion that gave Brennan's lawyers the legal leverage to push for a ruling in his favor, was built on documents that Roy himself had flagged years ago on someone else's instruction. He had not created false documents. He wanted to make that clear. But he had helped identify which real documents could be used to raise doubt. That doubt had then been used by someone who knew how the legal system worked to manufacture a dispute that had eventually reached a courtroom and been decided in Gerald Brennan's favor. "Did you ever hear Marcus's name?" Sarah asked. Roy shook his head. "Not from anyone connected to Harrow." "No. But the case Marcus won, was it built on those same documents?" Roy looked at his cup. "From what I read in the local coverage, yes. The boundary question that the judge ruled on was the same one. Whether Marcus knew where it came from, I can't say." Sarah drove home with that answer sitting in her chest. Marcus might be innocent. He might have taken a case with a poisoned foundation and never known who had poisoned it. A lawyer trusted their client. A lawyer worked with the documents they were given. It was entirely possible that Marcus had fought hard and won cleanly without knowing that the ground beneath the case had been arranged by someone else long before he was ever brought in. But it was also possible that he had known, or suspected, or chosen not to ask certain questions because the answers might have forced him to walk away from a case that would make his career. That evening, Sarah asked Marcus about Philip Harrow. She kept her voice casual. They were sitting after dinner, the children already in bed, the house quiet. She mentioned that she had run into someone who had asked about Harrow's development projects and wondered how things were going. Marcus looked up from the book he was reading. His expression did not change. "He's got a few things moving," Marcus said. "He's been asking about some land on the east side of town." "What?" "Just curious," Sarah said. "He seemed like a sharp person." "He is," Marcus said, and went back to his book. She watched the top of his head. She watched him turn the page. She looked at the hands she had held for 12 years and tried to find the answer in the shape of them. She could not find it there. The next morning, while Marcus was at the office, Sarah opened his home filing cabinet. She had access to it. She had always had access to it, because they had no secrets between them, or so she had believed. She was not looking to steal anything or use anything against him. She was looking for a simple confirmation, one way or another. She found it in a folder near the back. It was a short email, printed and filed, the kind of thing lawyers sometimes printed for paper records. It was from 8 months ago, from Philip Harrow's business address, sent directly to Marcus's personal email rather than his firm address. The email was brief. It thanked Marcus for his discretion regarding the sourcing of the boundary materials and noted that the arrangement would benefit all involved parties. Sarah read it twice. Then she put it back exactly where she found it and closed the cabinet. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time. The house was quiet around her. The morning light came through the window and fell across the floor in the same ordinary way it always did. She thought about her father sitting on that porch. She thought about Roy Teller and his hands around a coffee cup. She thought about the envelope in her father's desk drawer. She thought about the flowers Marcus had brought home and the way he had smiled in the doorway and said those 2 words, "We won." She understood now what they had won and what they had won it with. The decision she made next was not a fast one. It did not come in a flash of anger or a wave of grief. It came quietly, the way the most important decisions usually come, after all the feeling has moved through you, and what is left is just the clear, steady truth. She picked up her phone and called her father. "I found what I needed to find," she said when he answered. Daniel did not ask what it was. He simply said, "What do you need from me?" "Roy's testimony. That envelope. Everything you have." She paused. "I'm going to need a lawyer. Not one from Marcus's firm." Her father was quiet for a moment. Then, "I know someone. A woman I trust. She handled your grandmother's estate. She's not connected to any of this." "Call her," Sarah said. She hung up and looked at the kitchen, the same kitchen where Marcus had walked in with flowers 2 days ago, full of pride, full of celebration. She had smiled at him then and meant it. Some part of her still loved the man she thought he was. But she had learned in the past 4 days that the man she thought he was and the man he had chosen to be were not entirely the same person. Her father had taught her that the truth had a way of coming out. He was right. It always did. The only question was whether you chose to face it yourself or waited until it arrived at your door without warning. Sarah had chosen to face it. She stood up from the table, walked to the window, and looked out at the ordinary street outside her ordinary house. Then she took a long, steady breath and began making the calls that would change everything. Not with fury, not with revenge in her heart, but with the clear and quiet certainty of a woman who had decided that the truth, however hard, was the only ground worth standing on.